Today we are joined by John Bruning. John is a New York Times bestseller and author of the newly released 53 Days on Starvation Island, the World War II battle that saved Marine Corps Aviation. This riveting tale tells the story of the ferocious Battle of Guadalcanal and the handful of Marine aviators who risked their lives to buy time and save the lives of their fellow stranded Marines. Enjoy the episode. Well, John, welcome to American History Gazette.
Hey, thank you very much, Jake. It's a real pleasure to be here.
You've written many books, you're a best-selling author, and you're here today for your new book, 53 Days on Starvation Island, which is about the Battle of Guadalcanal, America's first offensive in World War II. But can you just tell me, why did you write this book, and how did you come to the title 53 Days on Starvation Island? Because I think that's a pretty cool title.
Cool, thanks. Well, actually, the genesis of the book goes back to when I was in grad school in 1991. I was a student at the University of Oregon. I was writing my original master's thesis on the efficacy of naval aviation training prior to World War II and how that training affected the first 6 months of the Pacific War. And I started searching for any of the vets that I could find around Eugene who had trained in the 1930s, pre-war. And Marion Carl, Major General Marion Carl, lived in Roseburg. So I wrote him, and I mean, he was like a childhood hero of mine. I mean, I read Greatest Fighter Missions in third grade by Edward Sims, and one of the first chapters is Marion Carl. And here's Marion Carl, this Marine Corps general, gives this kid from, the University of Oregon's grad school program a chance to come down and talk to him. This is not a trivial thing because the U of O, um, it was a hotbed of anti-Vietnam resistance in the 60s and early 70s. In the 70s, the ROTC building was burned down. So, Marion Carl invited me to his home, not knowing anything about me. I was just, 23-year-old kid with a mullet and huge Coke bottle glasses. I drove my 1956 Ford Victoria down to his spread on the Umpqua River and spent the day talking with him and interviewing him. And ultimately, when I walked out of that house and that encounter with this, amazing human being, I realized this is what I wanted to do with my life was interview these amazing men and women. And so 1,500 interviews and 2 decades later, 3 decades now, we're well into the third, I guess. Um, I made a career out of doing oral history. And in 2010, I was in Afghanistan, and I had kind of an interesting experience when the helicopter I was on started to belch smoke out of the aft pylon. I was in a Chinook, and we made a precautionary landing so we didn't catch fire. And while we were on the ground there, the Taliban was watching from the nearby hills. Um, I made a bucket list of books that I wanted to write about, and one of them was writing about Marion Carl and the first two squadrons that went into Guadalcanal in August of 1942. So that's the genesis.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, the humility and empathy that he showed, because as you said, college campuses at that time were a hotbed of anti-war protests and sentiment. And for him to accept this college kid that he didn't know into his home to ask him about his experience at Guadalcanal is amazing to me. And I'd just like to ask, what was that process like for you? What was that experience like for you to be able to sit down with one of your childhood heroes and talk about something you were so passionate about, the Pacific Theater and World War II and all this history, and to be able to sit there with the man himself who was there, what was that experience like? What did you guys talk about?
Oh, wow. Wow. That was, it was, I've told Marion's son, Bruce, many times it changed my life. It really did. Um, so I remember getting the letter back from Marion and saying, "Yeah, come on down. Here's my address." Uh, I called him. We set up a time, and I actually, before I actually went down there, I spent every waking minute studying everything I could find about Marion Carl. Every single source I had, and then I went and raided the newspaper stacks at the University of Oregon. There was no newspapers.com back in 1991. And as it happened, the interview happened in January of 1991. It was a beautiful day, which is rare in Oregon in January. And it was right as the air campaign for the Gulf War started. So there were massive protests on campus at the U of O. So I drove down, sat across from him in his living room. The first thing I noticed was he was so tall. I mean, you see in print, that he was, I think, 6'4". It doesn't do him justice. I mean, he was just a towering figure, and he sat with a presence that I had never encountered before in my young life. Just you could tell he was made of solid steel, you know, and yet he was a complete gentleman. He was very nice. Every question I asked, he considered very carefully and then answered to the best of his ability. And I went into, like, I had all of these really detailed questions. Like, when he was at Midway, I wanted to know what color the aircraft were that he attacked, uh, and he thought about it and started describing the black cowlings and the green upper surfaces and the gray and undersurface of the Zero that he attacked. And it was really just an amazing, detailed. Um, I think we spent 3.5, 4 hours altogether, and I knew I was starting to wear him out. He was 76 at the time, but one of the most memorable experiences of that day was when he started describing for me how he met his wife, which is the culmination of the first section of the book. Actually, is their date night. Um, he was in New York on the Hero Tour. That is the first part of 53 Days, and he met this New York model, and he starts telling me about this date he had with her in New York, and they're going to all these clubs, and here he is, this dairy farm boy from small town Oregon, and he's just sparking with this New York model who was a Powers girl. The Powers models were considered among the most beautiful American women, and also the most intelligent, because when Powers signed models back in the 20s and the 30s and the early 40s, he wanted articulate, intelligent advocates and individuals. So they were formidable human beings. And so Marion gets paired up with this woman named Edna, and they have a great time together. And he tells me, and 2 weeks later, we were married. Okay, whirlwind romance there. Wow. And he said, and then I brought her home to Oregon. By the way, the tale is from my cat Sylvie. If you follow me on any of the social medias, she's pretty much more popular than I am. And she's going to be in and out. Anyway, so he brings Edna back to small town Oregon, Hubbard, Oregon, and he just gives me this wry smile, and he goes, all these wags, all these gossips, they were saying, oh yeah, farm boy and model, it's never going to work. No way, no way. And he just let that hang, and he just had this sly grin on his face. And I finally asked, well, did it last? And he just grins back at me, and just big. And Marion Carl had just the most winning smile you can imagine, just huge, lit his entire face up. And he goes, "Do you want to meet her?" I'm like, yes, yes. They'd been married over 50, well, almost 50 years when I met him, and they were married for 57, I think, altogether. And then, the story of Marion Carl can't be told without, I mean, I'm kind of giving away part of the end here, but he sacrificed his own life to save his wife at the end of his life. So it's He was just an amazing human being. And we talked in detail about the deployment to Guadalcanal, how VMF 223 was formed. The story of 53 days is the 53 days that Marion Carl, John L. Smith, and Richard Mangrum and their men spent on the island. They were the first. They were the leaders, basically, who brought in the first two squadrons to Guadalcanal to provide air support for the Marines trapped there. And the 53rd day sees Dick Mangrum, the last man standing from his aviation component. He had some ground crewmen still there, but everybody else had been, all of his pilots and gunners had been evacuated, killed, wounded. Um, they had been medically evacuated because of disease or shell shock. So that's the end point of the book is Mangrum being the last one off the island.
Speaking of Guadalcanal, I'd like to backtrack now to, right after Pearl Harbor, as FDR said, the United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces, the Empire of Japan. So the U.S. is now fully involved in World War II. And following Pearl Harbor, we see the Battle of Midway, the Battle of Coral Sea, which you mentioned Marion fought in. But now comes the time for the United States' first offensive in the war, which is the invasion of the island of Guadalcanal. So just talk to me about the strategic importance of Guadalcanal and why this was chosen as the first point of attack.
The key thing to remember going in to Guadalcanal for the two squadrons, for Marion and John L. and Dick and their men, they really had no idea what the strategic importance was. They had never heard of the place, and they were being sent up there and told this is an important location. Uh, do your best. They had no idea what it was all about. But basically, what happened was the United States, after the success at Midway, where we were able to sink four Japanese aircraft carriers, we were looking around at Japanese intentions, and the Japanese still believed they had the strategic initiative, and it looked like they were going to be pushing into the New Hebrides and cutting off our sea lanes to Australia. And the first stepping stone to that operation was the establishment of an airfield that could provide long-range air support at Guadalcanal. So they started work, the Japanese did, on this bomber strip on Guadalcanal that later became known as Henderson Field. And that would have been able to project power deep into the American sea lanes and really get Japanese long-range bombers like the Betty and reconnaissance aircraft like the Mavis and the Emily deep into the South Pacific. And if they had been able to achieve that, our effort to turn Australia into a giant arsenal of democracy for both MacArthur's future offensives and much of what happens in 1942-43 in the Solomons and then in the Central Pacific would never have happened. And we would have been in a very different strategic situation in later on in 1942. And the Joint Chiefs recognized this. They knew that uh, if this airfield were built and the Japanese were allowed to perpetuate their offensive into those areas, that the war was going to be lengthened and it was going to be even harder to fight our way back across the Pacific. So the decision was made, even though we weren't ready, we didn't have the equipment we needed, we didn't have all of the resources, but the decision was made, okay, we've got to attack this island and take that airfield and stop this offensive. So really what this battle becomes isn't just, a fight over an airfield. It's all about wresting the strategic initiative away from the Japanese. And it ends up being a 6-month grind to do that. And the Japanese never really regained the strategic offensive after Guadalcanal. Midway stopped them. They suffered heavy losses, but it was Guadalcanal that really changes the strategic momentum in the Pacific, and it's never recovered by the Japanese. So this is Sylvie, and she's driving me crazy. I'm going to put her down. Anyway, um, that was the strategic value and importance and the reason why we did this. The problem was, like I said, we didn't have the resources to really pull off our first offensive 6 months after Pearl Harbor. None of the 1940 Two Ocean Navy Act ships had been completed yet. We were still increasing our output of pilots through the training commands. We were still trying to increase production of aircraft. We were still training Marine infantrymen and U.S. Army infantrymen. I mean, it was just an ad hoc, um, really chaotic offensive operation, and it became known. It was uh, uh, nicknamed Operation Shoestring. Originally, it was known as Watchtower, but everybody called it Shoestring because it really was a shoestring sort of affair. And the um, uh, the reality was, once the Navy got the Marines ashore on August 7th, 1942, they got about 16,000 Marines from the 1st Marine Division ashore. The Japanese were swift to respond via air and surface task force. They delivered a very telling blow at the Battle of Saved Island, sank 4 Allied cruisers the night after the landings, and that convinced the Navy to withdraw and get the transports out of there too. So the Marines are basically abandoned on the island with enough ammunition for 3 days of constant fighting. Okay. And they didn't have enough food, but when they had come ashore, they had seized the airfield and established a perimeter around it that was very thinly defended because the size of the perimeter was pretty large. And in the middle of the perimeter, they had found a bunch of Japanese food. So the captured stocks of Japanese rice and canned fish, that is what sustained the garrison for weeks. And the Japanese referred to the island as Starvation Island because they always had massive supply problems as well, in large part because of the dive bombers that Dick Mangrum brought in at the beginning of the campaign, but also because but also the U.S. Forces, the Marines, they were starving too. The pilots that I wrote about and the gunners, they went in, 5'11", 150 pounds with no weight to lose, and they lost 30% of their body weight in 53 days. So, like I said, it was a shoestring affair, and it's kind of miraculous that we were able to pull it off and not get pushed off the island with, catastrophic strategic and political repercussions for that.
Yeah, and it was huge for the Allies. I mean, looking back at this now, the key I think here is the airfield and stopping the advance of the Japanese forces, because if they were able to construct this airfield, it would have been disastrous for the Allies in the war. So, despite the lack of resources, despite the lack of training, the Americans, the Allies were forced to take action. So, not only did the Allies not have the resources and training necessary to conduct an operation like this, but this was such a new style of warfare that I don't think the Americans ever had any experience with. I mean, this whole island hopping campaign, fighting in the jungles, fighting in these islands, amphibious operations, this is such new tactics in the military. So, what did the planning process look like for this offensive? Because they have to conduct amphibious operations, which are very much unpracticed and new. They have a lack of resources, lack of training. This is a very rushed operation. So, how did the higher command plan this out in order to achieve a successful operation?
Well, first off, Admiral Gormley was in overall command, and he believed that it was going to fail. So he had a very pessimistic view of everything that was going on. And through the entire campaign, until he was relieved for his pessimism, I mean, he really lost control of the battle very early on. The planning was very hasty. They moved the actual invasion date up, which created even more issues because they were afraid the Japanese were going to get the airfield into operation. But one of the biggest issues, and it was a significant lesson learned, was that the Marines went in without any organic air power. They were going to rely on the U.S. Navy aircraft carriers offshore to give them the air support they needed until and the plan stipulated that they would get engineers ashore who could finish the airfield quickly, and then they would bring in air units. Well, the reality was they needed the air units there on day one. They needed to be on that airfield the minute it was captured. The airfield needed to be completed. Not everything got there. Not all of the equipment the Marines needed to finish the airfield was even offloaded. So they used a bunch of captured Japanese construction equipment they found around the airfield as they drove the first garrison off into the jungle when they first arrived, because they did achieve strategic surprise. The Japanese fled. They were able to seize the airfield very quickly on day one. So as far as how the planning affected John L. Smith and Marion Carl and Dick Mangrum and their two squadrons, the way this all shook out looked like this. So John L. was the squadron skipper for VMF 223. Up until the end of June, he only had a couple of Brewster Buffaloes in his squadron and 3 pilots and like a handful of ground echelon folks, most of whom had literally been civilians 6 months before. So he had the rump of a squadron. He didn't actually have a squadron that could do any actual training. And then in early July, he and Dick Mangrum, and Dick was in the same situation. 232 was at Eva on Pearl Harbor, and their aircraft were destroyed. And right after Pearl Harbor, Dick was given command of VMSB 232. This was a dive bomber outfit. They were equipped eventually with SBD Dauntlesses. But what happened was 232 essentially became what's the best way to put it? The rump of experienced ground echelon and pilots that was consistently sliced off to start new units and basically make the rump of new units. So essentially, it was like cells dividing. So half of 232 would be cut off in January, and another half in February, and another half in March, and so and so. So they didn't have the planes or the pilots or the ground crew to do any functional training until July. And then Dick and John L. get ordered to Marine Air Group 23's headquarters, where they met with the commander. He was actually the senior Marine aviator west of San Diego. Everybody called him the sheriff. And he sat the two skippers down and said, look, you guys are going to get reinforced. You're going to get aircraft, and you're going to get pilots from the States. You're going to get gunners and ground echelon. And that's going to happen over the course of the next week and a half. But you need to be ready to depart for combat in 30 days. Okay, so that's a formidable task. And that was built into the operational plan for the entire Guadalcanal campaign, was take these two units, these two squadrons that were thousands and thousands of miles away and half formed, build them up to strength hastily, and then throw them into battle while other units are formed and hastily trained and sent out too. So it was a very, very ad hoc, slipshod, non-optimal way to send young Americans into battle. And John L. and Dick knew it, and it actually got even worse when they started getting the pilots in and the gunners and the ground crew. Most of them had very little experience. Some of them had just been commissioned second lieutenants, literally a couple weeks before they arrived. And there were two loads really that came in, one aboard the escort carrier Long Island, and then the other guys, they were the Hilo boys. They came in on the USS Hilo, um, and they flushed out both squadrons. And these were a very diverse group of Americans from all walks of life, all backgrounds. I mean, in John L. Smith's squadron, he went from a couple of regular Marines to a bunch of second lieutenants who had a year before been fraternity kids at Stanford or Princeton, I'm sorry, Yale, or had been working in machine shops. They'd been farmers. They'd been from small towns all over the Midwest. So you had this melange of guys who never would have had any communication with each other in civilian life because of their different social circles and economic circles, thrown together with the only thing in common being they were Marines and they loved aviation, they loved to fly, and they bonded very quickly. But I mean, if you can imagine being a squadron leader in wartime and you're given guys who'd never even sat in the cockpit of the plane that you're going to be taking them into battle with in a month. I mean, you can imagine John L. Smith and Dick Mangrove's frustration over this. I mean, these guys were raw, really raw. And it led to John L. especially making a decision on how to run a squadron, which was very unusual. And it actually paid off in spades once they got to Guadalcanal. So the functional aspect of the plan to invade Guadalcanal for the guys I wrote about in 53 days was that they literally had no time to properly train against seriously the most experienced combat aviators in the world at the time. The Japanese naval pilots had been flying in combat and shooting planes down since the second lieutenants in John L. Smith's squadron had been on JV teams in their high schools.
Yeah, it's insane. And it really seems like all of the men at Guadalcanal were sort of guinea pigs for how the future operations in the Pacific Theater would play out. The higher command was gauging what would happen because no one had experience. And you said it beautifully. These guys are literally civilians a couple months ago, and they're fighting one of the most formidable forces in the world. And this is something that fills me with a lot of pride as an American because these guys, they were green, they were civilians thrown into the most brutal combat the world had basically ever seen, fighting a force like this and in these jungles. And they fought with so much courage and ferocity, and they won. They beat the Japanese here at Guadalcanal. And I look back and as an American, I'm just filled with so much pride that this is the legacy that I inherit from my ancestors. But can you speak to the Japanese forces and kind of their mindset behind warfare? Because, like you mentioned, these American soldiers were civilians a couple months ago. This is a very hasty operation. They didn't have a lot of experience. They didn't have a lot of training. And these Japanese forces, they're fighting for an emperor who they see as a god. They're ready to sacrifice their lives. They have experience. They've been doing this for years. So can you just briefly speak to the dichotomy between the American forces and the Japanese forces and their mindset when it came to warfare?
Well, I'll tell you, Jake, w- one of the reasons why I wrote this book was the very point you just made about having pride in what these young men accomplished. And these are American college students. Louis Macias was a Mexican American. His parents immigrated into the U.S. and he worked at a refinery in Wyoming. And Lewis's dad worked at the same one. I mean, and he joined the Marines and became the best gunner in Dick Mangram's squadron, as an escape to get out of that life. Ken Chambers was one of the youngest, greenest guys in VMF 223. He was from a little town called Princeton, Florida. His family made $600 a year, farming other people's. They were sharecroppers. They were farming other people's land. These were these were average Americans thrown into a situation that I can guarantee you no other American aviator has ever had to experience, ever. I mean, we're talking, once they got to the island, they were bombed day and night. They were shelled by artillery, by mortars. They were shot at by machine guns just at the end of the runway, taking off and landing. They were under fire. Once they got airborne, they were facing an enemy that did not have any mercy and would shoot them in their parachutes if they had to bail out. At night, they would be hunkered down in the jungle, in their bivouacs, and they would be bombarded by naval gunfire from Japanese task forces offshore. And then in between, they would take sniper fire. There were banzai charges. In fact, the first night they got there was what they called the Battle of the Tenaroo, which you see in it's either the first or the second episode of the series, The Pacific, where they're trying to cross Alligator Creek, and you have that entire night battle. That was their introduction, and that all took place about 1,000 yards from where they were hunkered down for the night. I mean, some of the guys slept under their SBDs, under the wings that first night, and actually for the first week they were there. And then later on, during the Battle of Edson's Ridge, some of the Japanese were actually able to get in through the American lines, penetrate to the airfield, and there was a firefight around the edge of the airfield that lasted all the next morning of the attack. And some of the guys got to their aircraft, um, and discovered that Marine sentries guarding them had shot Japanese soldiers off the wings of their planes, that they were actually going to try to destroy these planes with grenades or whatever they had available. Um, so you layer in the fact that they were starving. They didn't have their ground echelon for the first week or so that they were there. They didn't have proper food, medical care. Their living existence for a while was just under a tarp, sleeping on straw mats. Um, and they're flying between 2 and 4 missions a day. It was an insanely demanding time, and you know what? Very few of them failed to measure up to this. The vast majority of these young Americans, they were able to not just perform, but perform to a degree that they were able to stop a much superior Japanese force in the air over and over and over again. And at sea, the dive bomber pilots, despite their inexperience, were able to turn back 2 critical resupply convoys and destroy about a third of another one that came down in September. So uh, I find this an absolutely amazing testament to an average American thrown into the most god awful, horrible conditions imaginable and rising to the occasion. It's one of our legacies and part of our heritage. And one of the things that has really made me happy on Twitter is as I've seen people buying the book and reading it. Um, they're from all political backgrounds. I'm looking at their profiles. Here's somebody who supports BLM. Here's somebody who supports MAGA. But you know what? This is a legacy that is universal. If you're an American, this is part of your DNA. And it doesn't matter what you look like, who you vote for, your orientation, nothing. This is part of who we are. And I think, we often obsess because Americans are always interested in making things better. We obsess at looking at our skeletons in our closet, right? And we don't remember the good stuff. We forget the good stuff because we obsess over the bad because we want to fix it so badly. Well, here is something that's good. That's one of the reasons why I wrote 53 Days, because this is our heritage right here. And these guys really deserve to be remembered, especially because the Japanese, the enemy that they were facing was so good, and you cannot take away from the Japanese um, anything but massive respect for what their own soldiers, their own aviators tried to accomplish on Guadalcanal. I mean, you can criticize them for being very brutal. They were exceptionally brutal. There was literally no mercy shown by the Japanese army to anybody, civilian or military. I mean, you can see that going back to China, the rape of Nanking, what happens in Manila in 1945. They were a very, very brutal army, and it was institutionalized with the way they were trained. They were trained with a lot of physical violence, and that was true with the naval aviators as well as the army and the Special Navy landing forces, which was their version of the Marine Corps. So all of this is set in a context of horrible conditions, getting shot at 24/7 by an enemy with incredible bravery, just reckless, reckless bravery. Um, and these Marines, they saved a potentially catastrophic situation with their own courage and their own bravery and their own dedication, for sure. And you think, wow, guys from Yale did that. Guys from Stanford did that. Guys from Rutgers, you know, and then you have your average, blue collar guys. Oliver Mitchell was a Greek immigrant from Los Angeles. His family made a living with a little tiny grocery store in East LA, and and he ends up being one of the key members of VMSB 232, the dive bomber squadron. It's just an amazing story to me, and that's one of the reasons why I spent an extra long time writing this book, was to make sure that their stories were included.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said. This stuff, this transcends politics, this transcends opinions, this transcends orientation. Like you said, this is our heritage, and I think it's very important to understand our heritage. Like you said, we like to look at the skeletons in our closet, and we like to say, oh, the US is screwed. We have all this stuff going on. But if we were to look back at this stuff and harness that legacy of all the good, I think it would do a great service to our country. And this kind of stuff hits especially hard for me because these guys were my age, even younger than me. I'm 21. So 80 years ago, that would have been me over there. And that's why I love studying World War II, especially because these guys were my age. They were everyday Americans from all walks of life who went across the world to expel evil from the world and fight with so much courage and valor that it's impossible for today's generations to comprehend because we've never had to deal with anything like this. And it's just amazing to look back on. But I'd like to flesh out this surprise attack on the U.S. naval fleet that kind of led to the abandonment, per se, of the Marines on the island. And this is really what set the stage for the Marine aviators that you write about to shine, because the U.S. naval fleet that was supplying the Marines and providing reinforcement was forced to retreat from the surrounding waters because of this surprise attack from the Japanese fleet, and it just left the Marines on the island out to dry. And this is what forced those Marine aviators to step up to the occasion and fend off the Japanese until the Marines were able to be reinforced again. So can you just flesh out that naval battle that took place that forced the U.S. naval fleet to retreat, and how that set the stage for the Marine aviators to step up to the occasion?
So initially, the carriers were under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. He was one of the most experienced admirals by this point in the war. He'd been in multiple carrier battles, and he was in overall command of the carriers and the air component that supported the initial landings. And once the landings were effected, there was an air raid that came in from Rabaul later that day on August 7th. And there was a wild dogfight between the Combat Air Patrol and these incoming bombers. And then the next morning, I think it was the 4th Air Group came back with torpedo-armed Bettys and attacked the fleet in the morning a second time. And there was another battle over that. Then later that night, a surface fleet of Japanese cruisers and destroyers crept into the invasion area, which was Savo Sound. And the intent was to get to the transports and sink the transports. They actually encountered the American screening force, which was plussed up with an Australian cruiser, and surprised it. And in the middle of the night, they had this enormous battle. The Americans did not perform very well at all. They, in fact, at one point thought that it was friendly ships firing on them. So there was, in several instances, a refusal to open fire because they didn't want a blue on blue incident to be worse. And the result was four cruisers, U.S. cruisers, were sunk to minimal Japanese losses. And between that and the air battles from the previous days that had knocked out a number of F-4F Wildcat fighters, Fletcher decided he was going to withdraw his carriers early, and that would leave the Marines with no air cover. And the transport force commander, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, absolutely refused to expose his transports to air attack without any kind of combat air patrol over him. So he agreed to unload for a few more hours and then withdraw the transports so they didn't get destroyed because Fletcher had abandoned them. And so the transports withdraw, only half to 2/3 or a third unloaded. So that's the genesis of how the Marines got left behind. Now, how that actually affected the guys that I wrote about in 53 days was even more chaos because they had been told they would have a month to train and they would have to be ready to leave by early August. And they were set to depart on a Tuesday in early August. The two squadrons decided, the skippers decided to send them on leave. So they all went into Honolulu. They were, blowing off steam, having a good time. And word came that they had to depart in 48 hours. So it was this enormous logistical yard sale to try to get these two squadrons loaded aboard the USS Long Island, CVE-1, our very first escort carrier, in 48 hours and set sail. And they were able to do it, and I only left one guy on the beach that they couldn't find. So, but I mean, that little carrier was just crammed with everything they could possibly fit into it. The airplanes themselves were crammed with spare parts, and they headed south, and it took almost 3 weeks to get down to the South Pacific. And while they were heading down, they actually got diverted to Fiji because the Marines, the Marine Command, actually the entire command in the South Pacific wasn't even sure that the airfield was going to be in Allied hands by the time the Marines were ready to fly up there. So they were diverted, they went to Fiji, and that's where they first learned the news of what was going to happen to them. And a staff officer flew into Fiji from Gormley's headquarters and briefed Mangrum and briefed John L. Smith. And then they in turn briefed their men. So that stay in Fiji was very significant. And then they headed up. They had a brief stop at Afate, where they swapped out some of their most inexperienced pilots for some better trained and longer in service Marines that were from a different squadron that was defending Afate. And then they steamed north to a point that was 180 miles south of Guadalcanal. And their last instructions came from Lieutenant Colonel Fike, uh, who was their senior officer present. And he said to them, gentlemen, your job here on Guadalcanal will be to buy time with your lives. Essentially, die hard. And in the meantime, we're going to get as much um, uh, support, reinforcements, aircraft gathered in the South Pacific as possible to push up to support you. But in the meantime, you're just going to have to hold the line. And you can imagine the mindset they had taking off from that little aircraft carrier after that lecture. You know, you're basically going up there to die and you know, do as much damage as you can before you get killed.
That's insane. I mean, these guys were really just left out to dry. They had no resupply routes, they had limited resources, limited ammunition, and it was up to them to hold off the Japanese before the U.S. naval fleet could reassemble. And like you said, they were told they had to buy time with their lives, but I think they exceeded those expectations and fought with so much valor and courage that they were able to hold off the Japanese and eventually defeat them, and not only just buy time with their lives, but achieve victory. And I think this is really where those Marine aviators really come into play, because to kind of sum it all up, you know, the Allies invade Guadalcanal, they take the airfield, so now they have control over the airfield. Their naval fleet gets defeated, so now they're left out to dry, and you have these Marine aviators on the airfield, these Marines on the island, left out to dry, and now it's up to these Marine aviators to attack the Japanese supply routes and attack their resources and attack them to like you said, buy time. So putting yourself in the shoes of these Marine aviators, what was it like for these guys, and how were they able to hold off the Japanese with limited resources, with existential threat, and then eventually hold them off long enough for the U.S. naval fleet to reassemble?
Well, that's a really, really key question because it's a testament to John L's leadership and also to Mangram's leadership. When they looked at, you know, the quality of pilots that they had and the training that they had, they realized, especially John L. realized, there was no way he was going to turn them into, you know, experienced fighter pilots in a month. He just couldn't do it. So he focused on two critical tasks. One was gunnery. If you can't hit anything in the air as a fighter pilot, you're not going to be much use to anybody. And their primary task that you realized they would be doing would be intercepting bombers. So the best way to intercept Japanese bombers, according to Marine Corps and Navy doctrine, was something called the overhead pass, which was very difficult. It required high deflection shooting, but it minimized the chance of the Marine plane getting hit. So basically, you would be up high and you'd roll down into a screaming steep dive uh, down onto a formation of Japanese bombers. You'd take one shot, you'd go through the formation, you'd dive out the other side. There's no way, if you do it right, that the escort force of Zeros could catch you. So they would dive out and just head back to Henderson Field, unless they thought they might be able to get a second shot in, and then they zoom climb back above the formation and go after them a second time. So that is how John L. trained his guys. So when you hear things about, you know, the mutual support tactics like the thatch weave that the Navy had invented, John L. didn't have time to teach those sophisticated tactics to his guys. He just taught them dive straight down on the enemy and shoot them. And he worked on deflection shooting and he worked on that tactic over and over and over again for a month. So that's how 223 was going to fight. With Mangrum, his guys, they had a unique challenge, which was The dive bombers carried one bomb. So you have one shot at actually making a difference. You're rolling in from 12,000 feet into a 70-degree dive against very small targets like destroyers carrying troops or smaller troop transports. This wasn't like at Midway where, the Navy pilots were going after capital ships that were, fairly awkward to maneuver it and easier targets. When you look at what happened the day after the carriers were sunk at Midway, there was a combined strike of, I think, 59 Dauntless dive bombers that went looking for any surviving Japanese carriers, and they didn't find them, but they did find a Japanese destroyer. And one by one, those 59 Dauntlesses with fairly experienced Navy pilots dove on that destroyer, and every single one of them missed, and the destroyer shot a couple of the SBDs down. So this is not an easy thing to do, and the Mangram's guys were facing high-speed destroyers who were running down the Solomon Islands to deliver troops and supplies off of their decks. It was called the Tokyo Express. They also sent two transport forces with cargo ships that were easier to hit, that that Mangram's guys attacked and played a significant role in turning around and defeating those convoys. So what Mangrum focused on with his guys through that training cycle was getting the bombs on target. Just one dive after another, after another, after another on simulated targets, on simulated decks, and they worked through those tactics very successfully. What made all the difference for the second lieutenants in Mangram's squadron was a guy named Baldy, Lawrence Baldinus. He was a Czech immigrant whose family settled in Michigan initially and then ultimately in Chicago. His dad was a steel mill worker, blue collar, and when Baldy was old enough, he was working in a spring factory. I mean, like making metal springs. And he joined the Marine Corps pre-war to get out of that life and was an enlisted man. And eventually he got a coveted slot in the enlisted pilot program that the Navy ran, and he became what they called one of the flying chiefs. For the Navy, it was chiefs, but with the Marine Corps, he was an NCO. But just before the squadron fleshed out with all of these brand new second lieutenants, Mangrum had Baldy commissioned as a second lieutenant, which was actually a detriment to him because he was making more as a senior NCO than he was going to make as an officer. So he was less than thrilled with the idea of it. But what Mangrum did was actually quite brilliant because his second lieutenants, they were Marines in name only. They hadn't gone through Paris Island. They hadn't gone through any of the normal, Marine boot camp route. They were all guys who went through the aviation NAVCAD program and then got invited to the Corps because they were top 10 in their class. So he needed somebody with experience at the second lieutenant level who could mentor these kids and show them the ropes. And not only did he do that, he led them with example by example, and when they were actually in battle, he became easily the best dive bomber pilot in the squadron, and he repeatedly scored hits. He was an absolute lug nut to the squadron, and when he ends up out of action, it essentially cripples the squadron. It was really the end of 232 when that happened. And I don't want to give too much away. All that's in the book. But here's this guy who's an immigrant from Chicago. Nobody's ever heard of him. This is again another example of these just remarkable Americans who did amazing things, and they did it totally anonymously So when I was writing the book, I was like, we need to give plenty of page time to this particular individual because he really deserves it after all of these years.
Yeah, they absolutely deserve much more credit than they've been given. But can you speak to the type of aircraft at play here at Guadalcanal for the Americans, and what they were working with, and how those held up against the Japanese Zeros, and then also the experience difference between the Marine pilots versus the Japanese pilots?
So John L. Smith's guys were flying F4 F-4 Wildcats. So they got a contingent of factory fresh Wildcats just before they shipped out. They weren't great fans of the Dash 4 model of the Wildcat because they added in the factory two extra guns to give them six 50 caliber machine guns. But those two add-on machine guns were outboard in the wings, and those 50 cals weigh what, about 125 pounds each. So it reduced the maneuverability of the aircraft, which already was an issue because the Zero was so much more maneuverable than the Wildcat. So they weren't great fans of the Wildcat in that regard. But the thing that they came to really respect about it, and it was a painful lesson learned from Midway. The Brewster Buffalo was the other fighter that the Marines had flown in battle prior to Guadalcanal. The Buffalo did not have armored headrests. The slab of armor behind the pilot just extended to about shoulder level. So when the Buffaloes from VMF 221 intercepted the Japanese air raid that hit Midway on June 4th, they were shot up and lost 14 of their guys in just a matter of minutes out of 25. And many of those guys were suspected to have been killed by Zeros shooting at them from behind, and then they were hit in the back of the head or the neck and the shoulder. Uh, the Wildcat didn't have that deficiency. It had a very good sheet of armor behind the pilot that extended to above his head. So there were times where they just couldn't get away from a Zero, and the guys would just hunker down behind that armored slab, and the Wildcat would just take the punishment. And even if the aircraft caught fire, they knew that they would probably get through it without a catastrophic wound because of that armor plate behind them. So the Wildcat then becomes, the aircraft that can withstand the abuse from the Zeros, but can't dogfight with it. And John L. Smith knew that. I mean, by July of 1942, everybody knew you don't dogfight at Zero. It's just way too maneuverable. But they mitigated that with the diving attack tactics, the hit and run strikes, and then unless they were escorting the dive bombers and Mangram's guys, they weren't even going to try to mess with the Zeros unless they absolutely had to or had an opportunity to get a lucky hit and run strike on a Japanese fighter pilot. So the whole disparity between the aircraft types on the fighter front, they mitigated it by trying to avoid them as much as possible and using the Wildcat's ruggedness and its ability to dive uh, much more robustly and faster than the Zeros. So that was uh, that was the fighter side of the house. The dive bomber side of the house, the SBD out and alone by itself on a search strike mission, uh, looking for Japanese convoys, Japanese ships. That's an incredibly exposed, very, very, very vulnerable airplane. Uh, the Dauntless was beloved by its crews because it could handle abuse just like the Grumman, but and it was something that was very rugged and functional in the field with minimal amounts of maintenance. They could run them for a long time that way. So the Dauntless was really tough, very rugged. It was an exceptionally good dive bombing platform. In fact, we never came up with a better dive bombing platform. The plane that replaced it, the Helldiver, was not nearly as good of a dive bombing platform as the Dauntless was. But the fact is, it had two forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns that quickly failed on Guadalcanal. The synchronization gears went out on almost all 12 of the ones that Mangrum brought in. Uh, and then the rear seat gunners had twin 30 caliber Brownings. That's not a lot of armament to try to fend off, Japanese Zeros. Um, so, the best route that the dive bomber pilots had was to avoid contact with any enemy fighters at all possible cost. Um, Doctrinally, they were trained to fly in tight formations to mask their firepower that they did have. But practically on Guadalcanal, they couldn't do that because the dive bomber guys had a dual mission. The first was searching for the enemy planes, and then the second one was striking the enemy planes. So every morning, you'd have half the squadron out on search patrols and maybe five or six available planes waiting to launch a strike. So it's, you can't mass a squadron doing that. Um, so they were always used in small numbers from the squadron perspective. Now, very early on during the Battle of Eastern Solomons, some aircraft carrier-based Navy SBDs arrived on Guadalcanal and ended up on the island for quite a while, and they folded in under Mangrum really, and became sort of an adjunct to VMSB 232, and that was the Flight 300 guys. Um, so they plussed up the unit with those aircraft, but the numbers that they had available at any given time, I mean, it really was never more than about 20 operational with Flight 300. So that's pretty much the distinction between the different aircraft types. The bombers that the Wildcats from John L. Smith's squadron faced were largely the G4M Betty, which was a very long-ranged twin-engine bomber, land-based. And very early on, they learned that getting behind one of these Bettys could be very, very dangerous because they had a 20 millimeter cannon in the tail that took down one of the 223 pilots on one of the first intercept missions. So after that, they made sure that they never gave that gunner a shot, especially a low deflection one, like coming in from dead 6 o'clock. That was a ticket to disaster. The weakness that the Betty had, of course, was that it didn't have any armor plating. It didn't have any protection for or self-sealing fuel tanks, protection for the fuel tanks or the vital spaces. So it was easy to hit them and cause them to burn. And in fact, the Japanese crews called their planes the Type 1 lighter because of that. So, they traded protection and survivability for um, its ability to deliver ordnance over long distances. And here at Guadalcanal, it cost them because they were flying about 600 miles each way um, for these missions to hit Guadalcanal, and they sapped the crews. It was a really, really, really rugged ask to have them do that day after day after day. And there were times where they just couldn't do it anymore. The crews were so worn out. So you see like a lull in mid-September where the Japanese crews were just so fatigued, and the number of planes available had dropped so much that Guadalcanal didn't get hit for several days. I think it was actually a week, maybe even more. Uh, so that's kind of the distinctions. And one of the biggest advantages the Americans had in all of this was if a Wildcat went down during an intercept mission, the pilot, if he landed in the water and was picked up or landed anywhere near the perimeter, he could get back to Henderson Field fairly quickly. Whereas a Japanese crew that bailed out ended up in the water and very rarely made it back. And even when they did make it back to Rabaul, if they were picked up by friendly Japanese troops, it sometimes took months for them to actually get back and become operational and start flying again. So that allowed the Marines to lose almost all of their aircraft at one point or another, and yet keep fighting as more aircraft came in because, John L. got shot down. He walked back into the perimeter. Marion Carl got shot down. It took him 5 days, but he got back to the perimeter. And that sort of thing. Robert Reed was another one. He was a VMF 223 pilot shot down over by Tulagi, which was across Savo Sound. And he was able to get back because the natives were generally friendly and would assist downed American pilots. They wouldn't do that with the Japanese. So if a Japanese crew got shot down and they bailed out or crash landed on a beach, if they were found by the locals, they were going to be killed. Their only hope was to fall into or to find Japanese troops. So that was a major distinction in the battle, and it actually significantly stacked the deck for the Marines, ultimately.
So how? I mean, this carries out for months. This intense fighting, holding off the Japanese. So how did they eventually turn the tide of the battle and have the U.S. naval fleet reassembled, reestablish those supply routes to eventually take the island and expel the Japanese out?
The first thing to keep in mind is that the two squadrons that got there originally, they were the ones who they held the line, they stopped the Japanese. It was a bloody standstill. When they left, there were more units that had come in, and there had been units that had been arriving starting at the end of August, that were joining the fight. There was a U.S. Army Air Force squadron of P-400s that came in, and then VMF 224 under Bob Gaylor arrives. Eventually, there's another dive bomber squadron that comes in. I mean, they fed the reinforcements piecemeal into what became known as the Cactus Air Force. Guadalcanal was codenamed Cactus. So uh, in later years, they were all known as the Cactus Air Force. That name came later, um, to define them, but at the time they weren't known as that until later in September. The great contribution the first two squadrons made was interdicting enough of the Japanese reinforcements to disrupt their first real land offensive against the perimeter, and that was the Battle of Edson's Ridge. And it was an extremely well conceived plan based on extremely good intelligence. And that whole story is kind of tragic because once General Kawaguchi landed his brigade there, uh, they were looking at how best to attack the Marine perimeter, and an American pilot fell into their hands, and they tortured him for information and then killed him. And despite everything I attempted, we could not determine who that pilot was. We narrowed it down to a couple, but exactly who he was, I don't think we'll ever know. Um, but he broke, and you can't blame him for that. The Japanese had methodical ways of torture that caused almost anyone to break. But he revealed that there was almost no defenses on the south side of the perimeter. And so Kawaguchi, looking at a map, said, okay, well, we'll go over this ridge and we'll just pour right into the airfield then. Well, it turned out through a whole series of circumstances that a Marine Raider battalion was occupying that ridge. And that actually saved the perimeter because if they hadn't been there, Kawaguchi could have rolled right into the airfield and split the Marine perimeter and caused them to essentially decamp and go fight a guerrilla war in the jungle. And that was the plan. They would stay fighting on the island as long as they could. Um, the Marines would, and fight a guerrilla war until the Navy could come back. But because of the number of ships that VMSB 232 had sunk, along with their Flight 300 component, they hadn't got the number of reinforcements that they had expected. And then there was a second major resupply effort done with landing barges and landing craft. They called it Ant Freight. And the Dauntlesses hunted those barges all through the beginning of September, and they were able to kill or wound over 300 of the 1,000 plus Japanese troops that were being shuttled down to Guadalcanal on these things. And because of the disruption they inflicted on those little barge convoys, they landed all over the place. They didn't land as an organic force, and the largest group landed west of the perimeter, away from Kawaguchi's main force anyway. So he was the pilots and the gunners from 232 end up denying Kawaguchi almost a battalion plus in troops, and killed another 300. So it was a significant moment because the Battle of Edson's Ridge was such a near-run thing. Had they had those extra 1,000 troops, they probably could have pushed through and reached the airfield in strength. As it was, they got there in very small numbers, and they were quickly mopped up. But really, as I studied this and studied the accomplishment of the aviators through this time period, I think it really hasn't been acknowledged, even though there's been much written on the Guadalcanal campaign over the years. It really has gone unacknowledged that this was probably the most important role those first two squadrons played, stopping those reinforcement convoys, especially the barges. So that battle, Edson's Ridge, happens in the middle of September. There's a little bit of a lull while the Japanese are essentially taking stock, making new plans, and reinforcing their shattered air units. And as that's going on, the Navy comes in with the 7th Marine Regiment. So that's the first significant U.S. Navy operation after the Battle of Eastern Solomons. So they get more troops in, and at night, the U.S. Navy was sending in what they called APDs, fast destroyers. They were World War I four-stackers that were turned into fast transports. Many of those end up getting destroyed, but they continued to bring in vital, aviation fuel, vital personnel. There were several other convoys that were able to get into Guadalcanal with food and more ammunition. So that becomes a key part of September for the garrison, because the Navy does come back. They just can't do it in the kind of strength that could turn the tide completely. And then in early October, the Japanese are getting ready and building up the forces necessary for another major effort to reinforce their guys on the island and launch another assault. And at that point, that's when the first two squadrons are withdrawn. So they end up leaving just as the first battleship bombardment of Guadalcanal takes place. And they bring two old battle cruisers down from Rabaul, and they pound the Marines with the heaviest naval artillery I think any Marine has ever been under fire from. And at that point, there were some U.S. Army troops on the island as well from the 164th Infantry, and they were pounded too. And some of the men went insane under the bombardment. It caused massive damage. It destroyed almost every airplane on the airfield. It was a catastrophic moment, and yet the squadrons that basically took the baton from 223 and 232 were able to do enough damage and stop enough of the Japanese resupply forces that October that the next offensive failed. So what happens? The Japanese try again one more time in November, and you have a series of naval battles off of Guadalcanal, because by this point, the Navy's been fighting around Savo Island at night for weeks. And that culminates in a battleship engagement and two naval battles in November that really are the death knell for Japanese hopes to retake the island. And by December, they realize they're going to have to get their men off or just abandon them. So eventually, the Japanese evacuate the island in February, well, late January and early February 1943. And they did it with exceptional professionalism and skill. And the Americans didn't even realize that they were being pulled out, that the Japanese were leaving. They thought all of the shipping that was making it down to Guadalcanal was actually um, bringing in reinforcements for yet another attempt to retake the island.
That's insane. I mean, it seems that the Marines, the Allies, were constantly so close to losing the battle. Just this constant grueling combat over months, and just a few key small factors at play turn the tide towards the Marines. I mean, like that battle at the Ridge. It's like if they had just those 1,000 more troops, they could have taken the airfield, and it's just they were so close to losing this whole time. And I think that's a testament to, if they hadn't fought with so much ferocity and courage and resilience, then they probably would have lost the island.
Oh, absolutely. And to the Navy's credit, the Navy ends up fighting multiple surface battles over the course of the fall of 42. They end up fighting two carrier battles, Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, by the end of which the U.S. Navy is down to one available fleet carrier, and that's the USS Enterprise, which had been already hastily patched together after taking pretty severe damage at Eastern Solomons. So the cost for the Navy to get back in the fight was really heavy, really heavy. And ultimately, you're looking at 50,000 plus men from both sides died in this 6-month campaign, and 68 warships from both sides were sunk. So it was an enormous, enormous, costly battle.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been just a living hell, especially the artillery fire that the Marines were under. Like you mentioned, I mean, I can't even imagine the terror that you would feel, just constant explosive thunder raining down upon you, just relentlessly, unrelenting. And you don't know when it's gonna end. You don't know if you're gonna get blown up. It's harrowing for sure. But you've made the claim that this one battle reshaped the Marine Corps and Marine aviation. I'd like to ask, what do you mean by that?
Well, first off, you got to keep in mind that Marine aviation was wiped out wherever they made contact with the Japanese for the first 6 months of the war. At Pearl Harbor, every single Marine aircraft at Ava Field was either destroyed or damaged before even getting in the air. And then the second point of contact came at Wake Island with VMF 211. They were wiped out to the last plane, and then the pilots in ground echelon turned out to be Marine infantry and fought on the beach during the Japanese invasion of the atoll at the end of December. Um, and then the third point of contact was at Midway, where everybody remembers the Navy's great success sinking those four carriers, right? Well, the two Marine squadrons that were engaged, VMF 221 and VMSB 241, they were absolutely massacred. 221 had two flyable planes at the end of one mission out of 25. They lost their squadron commander, the guy who took over and was senior officer present, pretty much had a breakdown and just literally turned the survivors over to the senior NCO from the ground echelon and went and got drunk. Marion Carl actually talked a little bit about that to me when I interviewed him back in '91. Uh, and the dive bomber squadron flew 3 missions, lost 3 skippers in each of those 3 missions. So every time they went out, they lost their leadership, and most of the squadron was killed or wounded or went missing. So it had been a hard 6 months for Marine aviation, which was a tiny little, almost like an appendix in U.S. Navy naval aviation, because uh, the Marine Corps is part of the Navy, right? So the pipeline to become a Marine aviator was you had to go through the Naval Aviation Training Program, and then if you were in your top 10% of your class, you could decide, you could elect to go into Marine aviation. In 1939, there were 50 Marine fighter pilots. And I think there were less than 500 Marine aviators total um, uh, by uh, by late 41, by well maybe mid 41. So we're talking very fractional numbers compared to the U.S. Navy and the fleet's naval aviation component. Um, Guadalcanal, you see John L. Smith and Dick Mangram's squadrons validating the entire reason to have Marine aviation, which was to have a Marine component that was readily available for the ground troops to provide them support in whatever way they needed that support. And in fact, they did a lot of ground attack work as well. The first mission John L. Smith's guys flew was to strafe the Japanese assault echelons during the Battle of the Tenarue River. So close air support of Marine ground forces was a major, major doctrinal purpose of having Marine aviation. Uh, but none of it had worked prior to Guadalcanal because our guys were so poorly trained and so ill-equipped that the Japanese just made short work of them. But now here at Guadalcanal, that changes. And now you're seeing the wartime trained pilots starting to get into Marine aviation and into the frontline units. And as that continues through 43 and 44, you see the force evolving to hone their skills at all of the things that John L. Smith and Dick Magram's guys did and kind of paved the way for at Guadalcanal. And then from a larger standpoint, when you like zoom out to the 30,000-foot level and you look at how Guadalcanal affected the Corps in the years that followed, it was a massive, massive inflection point for the Marine officers who survived. When you look at the two squadrons, the John L's and Mangram's, they produced, I think it was 5 generals out of those two squadrons. And you're looking at 19 guys in 19 pilots from VMF 223 and 12 from 232. And among the generals are Marion Carl and Dick Mangrum. And we could talk about John L. and why he didn't get a star. It's a very tragic story. But um, Henry Hayes was one of the dive bomber pilots. He became a brigadier general. Rivers Morrell was John L. Smith's XO. He became a general. Um, so there were many guys who went on to positions of significant leadership within the Corps, not just later on during the war, but also during Korea and during Vietnam. And that culminates with Richard Mangrum becoming the assistant commandant of the Marine Corps in the middle of Vietnam. And Marion Carl becomes a major general and ends up in a series of significant leadership roles late in his career as well. In fact, it looked like for a while that he might end up as the commandant of the Marine Corps. He ended up retiring instead, but uh, these guys carried their experience of what happened on Guadalcanal with them all the way through their careers. And it informed every decision they made and every way they wanted to impact the Corps was to avoid ever going through something like that again.
Yeah, I think the Battle of Guadalcanal really gave the Marine Corps, and especially the Marine Corps Aviation program, legitimacy and credibility. It showed the higher command that, hey, this is a formidable force worth keeping. It's very important. and it kind of cements their legacy in a way that this is a force worth, funding and fighting for and building. And I also think it was a learning experience too. I mean, the Marine Corps probably learned so much from Guadalcanal, and they carried those lessons with them throughout the rest of the Pacific theater in World War II with the island hopping campaign and beyond, especially to current day. I'm sure there's tactics that the Marine Corps still uses today that they learned at Guadalcanal. But something that you wrote extensively about in the book, and that really fascinates me about war and psychology in general, is how these men reintegrate into society after going through such brutality, such savagery, such unfathomable conditions for the human mind and the human body, and just this brutal combat, killing people, seeing your best friends die, and then how you go back to the U.S. and try to reintegrate in society and live a normal life. Can you just explain how difficult that was for these men?
Uh, it's always exceptionally difficult to do that. Coming back from a war overseas, or even dating back to the Civil War, our guys returning from battle in the Civil War realized that they were dealing with two realities: their own experience of war and what the civilians at home thought that war really looked like, and that was all based on the media reports. So there's always a disconnect. With the Guadalcanal guys, I think it was worse for them because the conditions were so arduous. They came back wounded. They came back with tropical diseases that nobody knew how to properly treat for years. Some of them were sick for years and years and years after. Um, and so you see a lot of those guys struggling after World War II. And of course, there was just no VA support for that sort of thing, PTSD or, uh, the level of psychological trauma that they experienced, even if they didn't, uh, manifest as, victims of post-traumatic stress, was still significant. They all carried that wound with them for the rest of their lives. And some of them dealt with it better than others. Some of them had better support systems, more understanding families. John L. Smith was not one that had a very understanding wife. She was very critical of him. And that played a real dark factor in his post World War II life, unfortunately. But even guys like uh, Colonel Edson, who was the Raider Battalion commander, who becomes the hero of the hour and saves the Marine perimeter during the Battle of Bloody Ridge. It's his leadership and his men that basically stop Kawaguchi's offensive. And they do it even though they're outnumbered. They'd already been whittled down through some pretty heavy fighting, and yet he's out there walking the line, talking to his men through the entire battle, challenging them, cajoling them, throwing them back into their foxholes if they start to run. And he ends up committing suicide in the mid 1950s. And ultimately, John L. Smith also did as well. So yeah, it had a very profound effect on these guys. It lasted a lifetime.
That's so awful. I mean, I can't imagine how difficult that would be and how existential that feeling must be of the stuff you saw and that lack of understanding you have from your surrounding, because your family members, everyone around you, they have no idea what you just went through, and they don't know how to handle that kind of trauma and how to help you, because it's you can have having empathy is one thing, but it's another thing to even fathom the type of conditions and brutality that someone just witnessed.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
it's damn near impossible to be able to understand that.
No, you have to experience. I kind of liken it to uh, uh, in some ways of having a child because you can talk about it, you can read about it, you can do everything you can to amass as much knowledge on having a child, but until you go through it, you have no freaking clue what that really entails and what it means and the emotional response. I mean, obviously it's positive compared to combat, but I'll tell you. So I went to Afghanistan in 2010, and I realized when I did that the way I had been writing about war was it was just off because here I was a civilian who was just writing it based on what I had read or heard from other people. Now that I experienced it firsthand, it changed how I approached it 100%. Um, and one of the moments there, as I was heading back home, actually, I was at Kandahar at the airfield there. As I was walking towards the PAX terminal, an F-18 went blasting down the runway, and I looked over, and it was VMFA 232 was written on the fuselage. So it was the legacy of Dick Mangrum and the Red Devils of Guadalcanal passing me on the runway, going off, heavily loaded. They were going to go do a close support mission, the exact same things that the Marines did so well through the rest of the war. So yeah, I mean the legacy was right there. It was a reminder, you got to write this book, John.
Yeah, wow, that's so incredible the way it came full circle like that. Were you working on this book at that time, or is that kind of what inspired you, or part of what inspired you to write it?
Oh, it was definitely a little bit of both. I mean, I did want to write it eventually. I had been doing research on and off for years. But when I saw it after I had had that moment when the helicopter went down, it was just a reminder. At the time, I wasn't particularly religious. I believed in God. Um, but I look back now and like that was a nudge. Go write this book. And it took me 10 years to figure that out and talk to Hachette and get approval to write it. And I really owe them a huge debt for allowing me to do so because these guys, they really deserve their memories to be shared and their experiences appreciated by the people who enjoy their legacy. And that's us Americans.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more. So, where can people get this book? Where's the best place to buy it?
Uh, Bookstores anywhere, Barnes and Noble's carrying it, independent bookstores are carrying it. You can get it on Amazon or barnesandnoble.com. Books a Million carries it. Yeah, just anywhere you find books, there'll be a copy somewhere.
Awesome. Well, I will have this book. I do have it. I will have it linked in the description below. So if anyone wants to pick it up and read it, I highly recommend it. John's an amazing guy, as you just heard. Um, but John, I want to thank you so much for coming on. This was an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to speaking again.
Yeah, Jake, thanks a lot. And what you're doing is amazing. It is so good to see. I really, really commend you because what you're doing is helping to tell our story and in a different way, in a different medium than what I've traditionally worked in. But it's really where uh, the generations following mine have gone. So what you're doing is carrying the torch now, and that's really important.
Well, thank you. That's very humbling. I deeply appreciate that. Thank you very much.
You bet. Great to meet you.